Ash Creek, Wyoming Territory, November 1888. 7-year-old Maggie Mercer had been taught not to stare, not the bright ribbons in the mercantile window, not at the oranges stacked behind glass, and never at another person's food. But hunger has a way of pulling a child's eyes where pride cannot follow. So when Maggie stopped beside a stranger's table in the Ash Creek Hotel, staring at a biscuit split open under brown gravy, her mother knew exactly what had happened before she even turned around. Eliza Mercer tightened her grip on the girl's hand. They had come to ask the hotel manager for laundry work. They had been told no again. Now all Eliza wanted was to cross the dining room before anyone noticed Maggie's hollow cheeks, or the strip of cardboard tucked inside Eliza's left boot where the sole had worn through. The rancher at the table set down his fork. He looked at Maggie, then at Eliza, then back at the untouched second biscuit on his plate. "Ma'am," he said, standing, "my cook believes one man can eat like three. I keep disappointing her. Would your girl help me save this meal from becoming an insult?" Eliza's answer rose immediately. No, it was the answer she had used for 6 months. "No, thank you. We are managing. We do not need anything." But Maggie's fingers had already loosened from hers. The child was not reaching for the biscuit. That made it worse. She was only standing there, waiting to be told she was allowed to want it. Eliza swallowed. "1 biscuit," she said, "and we will pay you back somehow." The rancher pulled out a chair as if they had merely arrived late. "Then sit down and owe me the pleasure of company." His name was Gideon Hale. That was the first thing he gave them. Not money, not pity, a name and a place at the table. Eliza's husband, Ben Mercer, had died the previous May when the east trestle over Willow Run collapsed beneath a freight wagon during the spring thaw. The bridge had been warned unsafe twice. The freight company used it anyway. Ben had been hauling oak ties for the railroad, a job that paid $1.60 a day when there was work and nothing when there was not. The wagon, the team, and Ben all disappeared into brown water before the men behind him could cut their traces. They found one horse 3 miles downstream. They found Ben 2 days later. What they did not find was the small iron cash box he had kept beneath their bed. Inside it had been the note for a wagon partnership that never earned $1. $940 borrowed from the Territorial Trust in Ash Creek. The Mercer cabin listed as security. And Eliza's treadle sewing machine added in Ben's handwriting beneath the line marked household assets. That machine had belonged to Eliza's mother. It was not furniture. It was the only reason Maggie had eaten at all after the funeral. Eliza could turn a flour sack into a child's underdress, a soldier's blanket into a winter coat, and a ranch hand's torn trousers into something that would survive another season. But Ash Creek was small, money was tighter than dust, and every woman with a needle was competing for the same few coins. By August, Eliza had sold Ben's watch. By September, she had sold the good stove and traded it for a smaller one that smoked when the wind came from the north. By October, she had started telling Maggie she preferred coffee for supper. A lie becomes easier after the 5th time. It does not become kinder. Gideon Hale knew that lie. He had heard his own mother tell it when he was 8. His father had died of fever after a cattle drive to Ogallala. The herd belonged to someone else. The debt did not. Gideon's mother kept 3 children alive by cooking at a line camp and washing shirts until her knuckles cracked in winter. He remembered the exact sound of her spoon scraping an empty bowl while she claimed she had eaten in the kitchen. He remembered believing her because the alternative was unbearable. And he remembered the first man who noticed. An old blacksmith named Amos Reed had begun leaving mistaken sacks of oats at their door. Gideon later learned half of those sacks had beans and salt pork hidden under the grain. Amos never asked for thanks. He only said a man ought to check his load before riding out. 26 years later, Gideon still checked. That was why Maggie's silence at the hotel table struck him harder than crying would have. Crying expected an answer. Silence meant the child had stopped expecting one. He cut the biscuit in half, poured gravy over both pieces, and asked Maggie whether she thought the hotel cook used sage or pepper. Maggie took the question seriously. "Pepper," she whispered. Gideon tasted the gravy as if considering expert testimony. "I believe you are right." For the first time that morning, Maggie smiled. Eliza looked away before either of them could see what it did to her. Over the next 3 weeks, Gideon discovered an astonishing amount of clothing on his ranch that required repair. 2 canvas coats, 4 work shirts, a pair of leather-lined gloves, 3 grain sacks that did not need mending nearly as much as he claimed, and a heavy lap robe from his freight sleigh with one corner torn loose. He paid Eliza the going rate. Then he added 10% because, he said, Ash Creek's going rate had been set by people who did not know how to sew. Eliza removed the extra coins and placed them on his kitchen table. Gideon placed them back inside the folded coat. They repeated this twice. On the third time, Eliza said, "If you keep doing that, I will stop taking your work." Gideon nodded. "Then I suppose I had better explain myself." He turned the coat inside out and showed her the seam. "You double-stitched the shoulder and bound the edge with twill. My last coat split there every winter, this one will not. I am paying for the part I do not have to repair next year." Eliza studied him. It was a fair explanation. Worse, it was true. She kept the coins. Maggie began asking to come with her on delivery days. At Hale Ranch, she fed cracked corn to the hens, learned that the bay mare tolerated children and the gray did not, and discovered a one-eyed barn cat who slept inside the hay chute. Gideon spoke to her like a small person rather than a burden waiting to become a larger one. He did not ask about her father. He did not call her poor thing. He showed her how to hold a flat palm under a horse's nose and how to keep her thumb away from a chicken's beak. One afternoon, Maggie laughed so hard at the barn cat falling into a bucket that she hiccuped. Eliza stood in the yard with a repaired coat over one arm and felt the sound move through her like warmth. "She has not laughed that way since May," she said. Gideon watched Maggie scramble after the cat. Children know when a place is safe. Eliza glanced at him. "And grown people do not." "We know," he said. "We just argue with ourselves longer." By the first week of December, the balance on Ben's note had fallen by only $43. Interest had added 21. Eliza knew the numbers because she copied them every Sunday evening into a small ledger and forced herself to look at the total until fear became arithmetic. She had until January 15th. That was the agreement Mr. Silas Crow at Territorial Trust had given her in June. It was not mercy. The bank could not easily sell a cabin at the edge of town before winter, and Crow preferred interest to an empty property. Still, a date was a date. Eliza built her entire winter around it. Then on December 9th, Silas Crow knocked on her door. He stood on the step in a beaver-collared coat, his mustache silver with frost, holding a folded notice in one gloved hand. "The Denver correspondent has called in 2 of our notes," he said. "The bank must improve its position before year's end." Eliza did not invite him inside. "My deadline is January 15th. It was. Maggie stood behind the curtain separating the sleeping room from the kitchen. Eliza could see one small boot beneath the fabric. Crow lowered his voice. "I am giving you 10 days. On the morning of December 19th, the marshal will take possession of the sewing machine and cabin unless the note is satisfied or replaced by acceptable security. 10 days? I regret the inconvenience." Eliza stared at him. "Inconvenience is a late coach, Mr. Crow." His eyes flicked away. "I do not make the conditions. No, you only bring them to the door." Crow placed the notice on the table. The paper sounded very loud in the little room. After he left, Eliza remained standing. Maggie came out from behind the curtain and put both arms around her waist. "Will they take Mama's machine?" Eliza rested her hand on the child's head. No. It was the first promise she had made all year without knowing how to keep it. That afternoon, Gideon found her at the sewing table with the bank notice pinned beneath the presser foot, as if the machine might stitch a solution through it. He read the page once, then again. "I can buy the note," he said. Eliza's foot stopped on the treadle. "No. I have enough in reserve to take it off Crow's books. You can repay me when—" "No. Eliza, listen. I heard you." She stood so quickly the chair struck the wall. "You saw us hungry once, and I let you feed my child. You brought me work, and I accepted because it was work. Do not mistake either of those things for permission to purchase my life from the bank." Gideon's jaw tightened. "That is not what I meant. It is exactly what you meant. You would put your name where Crow's is and call the chain kinder because you were holding it." The words landed harder than she intended. Gideon looked down at the notice. When he spoke again, the certainty had gone out of his voice. "You're right." Eliza said nothing. "I saw the deadline," he continued, "and I reached for the quickest answer. I did not ask whether it was yours." He removed his hat. "I know what it is to be hungry. That does not mean I know what it is to be you." The room went quiet except for the stove ticking as it cooled. "I am sorry," he said. "No defense." Eliza's anger did not vanish, but it lost the part that needed to keep fighting. Gideon folded the notice once and set it beside the ledger. "There may be another way," he said. "Not my money, your work." Eliza's eyes narrowed. What way? The Northern Mail Company won the winter route from Cheyenne to Fort Laramie. They need lined canvas coats for drivers and stable crews. 32 of them. The first supplier sent a sample that split under harness. How do you know? I haul feed to their relay station. Their superintendent complained for 20 miles, and you told him about me. No, Gideon met her eyes. I learned that part. He placed his hat back on his head. I told him I knew someone who could make a better coat. I did not give him your name. I asked whether he would examine a sample if that someone chose to bring one. Eliza looked toward the sewing machine. 32 coats in winter. The contract allows 6 weeks, half the payment on signing. One woman cannot finish 32 coats in 6 weeks. No, Gideon said. One woman cannot. That was the problem. It was also the first useful thing anyone had said all day. Eliza spent that night taking apart Gideon's old freight coat. Not cutting it, reading it. She studied where the canvas had gone shiny under the harness straps, where sweat had rotted the thread, where wind entered beneath the collar, and where the lining pulled loose when a man climbed onto a box seat. By midnight, she had drawn a new pattern on butcher paper. By 2, she had cut a sample from waxed duck cloth Gideon found in his storehouse. By dawn, she had added a double shoulder yoke, a short split skirt for riding, wool lining under the chest, and reinforced buttonholes stitched with linen cord. Maggie slept beneath the cutting table, wrapped in the lap robe Eliza had repaired 3 weeks earlier. At sunrise, Eliza held up the finished coat. It was not beautiful. It was better than beautiful. It made sense. The superintendent of Northern Mail was named Warren Pike, a narrow man with wind-burned cheeks, and the suspicious eyes of someone who had been promised too much by too many people. He examined Eliza's coat in the relay barn while 6 drivers watched. He pulled the seams, bent the collar, ran a thumb over the shoulder reinforcement, then handed it to his largest driver. Put it on. The driver did. He climbed onto a practice box, reached for imaginary reins, twisted left then right. The coat moved with him. Pike frowned, not because he disliked it, because he had run out of obvious faults. Can you make 32? Eliza did not lie, not alone. Pike's expression closed. But I can direct the work, she continued. Mrs. Danner at the laundry can sew straight seams. Ruth Bell sewed army shirts before she came west. Mrs. Coe has a treadle machine in the back of her dry goods shop. I cut every pattern, inspect every seam, and finish every harness point myself. 3 women, 3 households balancing on the edge of winter. Eliza had already spoken to them before she came. She placed a page on the feed bin. Names, hours, daily output, material cost, delivery schedule. Pike read it. You prepared all this overnight? No. The coat took overnight. The plan took the wagon ride. One of the drivers laughed. Pike did not. He looked at Gideon, who stood near the barn door. Is she reliable? Gideon answered without hesitation. Ask her. Pike looked back at Eliza. She held his gaze. Yes, she said. The superintendent picked up the sample coat again. Leave this with us. I will decide in 3 days. Eliza had 7. For the next 72 hours she could do nothing to improve the answer. That was worse than sewing. She returned to ordinary mending. She fixed a boy's coat sleeve, hemmed 2 dresses, replaced buttons on Gideon's work shirt, and listened for every set of wheels on the frozen road. None stopped at her cabin. On the 3rd evening, snow began falling from a low iron sky. By midnight, the road east had disappeared. On the morning of the 4th day, Gideon rode to the relay station. He came back after dark with ice on his beard. The station was closed. Pike had left for Cheyenne with the sample coat and the company books. When will he return? Eliza asked. No one knows. The south road is drifting shut. Eliza looked at the calendar. 3 days remained. The next morning, Silas Crow visited again. He did not come inside. I have heard there may be a commercial order, he said. There may. An unsigned possibility is not security. I know what security is. Crow's mouth tightened. The marshal will arrive at 9 on the 19th. Then he looked past her shoulder at the sewing machine. I suggest you remove any personal effects from the drawers. That night, Eliza did not sew. She sat at the table with Ben's ledger open before her and the lamp turned low. Gideon stood by the stove. Maggie slept in the other room. I can still buy the note, he said carefully. Only if you ask. Eliza traced the edge of the page. If I ask you, I will spend every year wondering whether I chose you or the roof. Gideon said nothing. She looked up. Do you understand? Yes? Most men would say they do and then try again. I already tried once. A faint smile moved across her face and disappeared. Gideon leaned one shoulder against the wall. What do you want me to do? The question settled between them. Not what should be done, not what he intended to do. What did she want from him? "Tomorrow," Eliza said, "I need you to take Maggie to the ranch." He nodded. "And after that, come back before 9 with money?" "No," she closed the ledger, "with yourself." The 19th arrived under 6 inches of new snow. At 8:45, Eliza swept the cabin floor. At 8:50, she folded Maggie's 2 dresses into a flour sack. At 8:55, she removed her mother's silver thimble from the sewing machine drawer and placed it in her pocket. At 9, Marshal Tom Vickers knocked. Silas Crow stood behind him with the bank notice. 2 neighbors had already stopped on the road. Then 4. Bad news drew a crowd faster than a fire in Ash Creek, especially when the wind was too cold for people to admit they were watching. Gideon arrived on foot from the livery, leading his horse through the snow. He carried nothing. Eliza saw that and breathed easier. Crow unfolded the notice. "Mrs. Mercer, the bank has received no payment and no acceptable replacements in security. Marshal, you may begin with the machine." Vickers removed his hat. "I am sorry, ma'am." "I know." He stepped inside. The sewing machine stood beneath the window, black iron base, walnut case worn pale where 3 generations of hands had lifted it. Vickers bent to release the floor braces. Gideon remained beside the door. Every muscle in his body looked ready to move. He did not. That was the promise. Then came the sound of sleigh bells from the east road. At first no one turned. Sleighs ran through Ash Creek every day. But these bells were followed by the crack of a long whip, the grind of heavy runners, and a man's voice shouting for the road to clear. A northern mail coach burst through the snowfall. Red wheels half buried behind it, 4 horses blowing steam. It stopped in front of Eliza's cabin. Warren Pike climbed down wearing the sample coat. The reinforced shoulder was dusted white. The harness split open cleanly when he stepped off the runner. The coat moved exactly as Eliza had promised. Pike carried a leather document case under one arm. "Mrs. Mercer," he called, "your road is difficult to find in weather." Eliza stepped onto the porch. "So is Cheyenne. I had business." He looked at Crow, the marshal, Gideon, and the neighbors gathered by the fence. "Am I late?" Crow answered before Eliza could. "For what purpose?" Pike opened the case. "For the purpose of hiring Mercer Outfitters to produce 32 winter driving coats at $14 each, with $224 payable upon signature." The road went silent. Even the horses seemed to listen. Pike handed the contract to Eliza. She read every line: delivery schedule, material allowances, inspection terms, payment dates. Her fingers trembled only once. Crow stepped closer. "That contract requires a registered business and guarantor." "It requires a registered business," Pike said. "Mrs. Mercer filed the trade name yesterday through Judge Hollis." Crow looked at Eliza. She had done it after the relay station closed, with $3 borrowed from the flour jar and no certainty she would ever use the paper. "And the guarantor?" Crow asked. Pike pointed to the clause. "Not for a maker with an existing equipment base and 4 named workers." Eliza took the pen. For one instant she saw Ben's handwriting on the banknote. Then she signed her own name beneath the words "Proprietor, Mercer Outfitters." Pike counted the deposit into her hand. $20 notes, $10 notes, 4 silver dollars, $224. More money than Eliza had held at one time in her life. She did not turn to Gideon. She turned to Silas Crow. "The bank will receive 180 today," she said. "The remaining 44 buys cloth and thread. You will restructure the balance over 18 months against the contract receivables, not against my machine." Crow stared at her. "That is not how the note is written." "No," Eliza said. "It is how the next one will be." A murmur moved through the crowd. Crow's face colored. Pike buttoned the coat against the wind. "My company will issue 4 more payments over 6 weeks. Territorial Trust may collect them directly if Mrs. Mercer authorizes it. Or Northern Mail can place the account with the bank in Cheyenne." Crow looked at the contract again. A foreclosed cabin in deep winter, a used sewing machine, or a paying commercial account tied to the largest mail route in the territory. The numbers did not need compassion. They only needed honesty. Crow folded the seizure notice. "Marshal," he said, "there will be no removal today." Vickers straightened slowly. "Glad to hear it." Crow turned to Eliza. "I will have revised terms prepared by afternoon." "You will have them prepared now," she said. "I have 32 coats to make." For the first time, someone in the crowd laughed. Not at her, with her. The sound spread until even Vickers smiled. Crow went back to the bank without another word. Eliza remained on the porch, contract in one hand, deposit in the other. Gideon waited until the neighbors had begun to leave. Then he came up the steps. "You asked me to come with myself," he said. "You did." "I nearly failed when Vickers touched that machine. I know, I had cash in my coat." Eliza looked at him sharply. Gideon raised one hand. It stayed there. A small laugh escaped her before she could stop it. "You are learning, slowly. The important lessons usually take longer." He glanced at the contract. "Mercer Outfitters. Do you object? I was wondering whether the proprietor might need someone to haul canvas. At a fair rate, naturally, and take instruction." He smiled. "That may cost extra." The workroom opened 2 days later in the back half of Mrs. Coe's dry goods store. 4 treadle machines ran from sunrise until lamplight. Eliza cut every coat. Ruth Bell assembled sleeves. Mrs. Danner stitched linings. Mrs. Coe worked buttonholes and kept the ledger. Gideon hauled canvas, delivered coal, and learned that entering a room full of working women without knocking could stop 4 machines at once, in a way that made a sensible man retreat immediately. Maggie slept on folded wool near the stove when evenings ran late. She was never told to make herself invisible. On the 6th week, Northern Mail accepted all 32 coats. Only 1 needed a seam repaired. Pike ordered 16 more. By spring, Mercer Outfitters had a narrow storefront on Ash Creek's main road with 2 words painted across the glass. Eliza Mercer, nothing beneath it. No widow, no charity, no explanation. Gideon proposed in April beside a wagon loaded with summer-weight canvas. He did not offer a house. He did not offer security, he said. "I have spent months trying to learn the distance between standing beside you and standing in your way. I would like the rest of my life to practice it." Eliza looked at the man who had first noticed her child was hungry, then listened when she told him noticing did not make him the owner of the answer. "That sounds like a long apprenticeship," she said. "I am prepared to begin at the bottom." She married him in June. Not because he saved the cabin, he had not. Not because he paid the debt, he did not. She married him because when the marshal put his hands on her sewing machine, Gideon had enough money in his pocket to stop it and enough respect to wait. Mercer Outfitters expanded twice in the next 5 years. Eliza employed 9 women, 6 of them widows, and paid by the finished garment at rates posted openly on the wall. Northern Mail renewed its contract each winter. Then the Union Pacific ordered canvas dusters. Then 2 cattle outfits ordered lined riding coats by the dozen. The banknote was paid 17 months after the Morning Crow tried to seize the machine. Eliza kept the final receipt in the same drawer as her mother's silver thimble. Maggie grew up among bolts of cloth, chalk lines, horse sweat, and women who knew the exact value of their own hands. She called Gideon Papa before their first anniversary. He pretended not to hear the first time because his eyes had filled too quickly. She never went to bed hungry again. Years later, when customers asked Eliza why the first sample coat hung above the shop door, despite its crooked left pocket, she would turn the shoulder outward. There, beneath the harness reinforcement, was a line of stitching made in the dark while her daughter slept under the cutting table. "That seam held," Eliza would say. What she meant was larger. A meal had kept Maggie alive for an afternoon. A contract had kept a roof over their heads. But the thing that changed their lives was harder to name. It was the moment a strong man understood that love was not taking the reins from a frightened woman. It was riding beside her and trusting that her hands still knew the road. Gideon never took the reins from her again. He simply stayed close enough that she never had to face the road alone.